Hi there, Ray here, and today we will take a look at a guide for PC parts. And before we start with the video, let me tell you what you can look forward to learn from this video. First, I will tell you how you should look for parts, but I will not tell you what specific parts to buy. After this video you will learn how to look for parts according to what is your budget, and what you want to do with that PC. So without wasting even more time with the intro, let's get into it. So when we start building the PC, you will need to choose a CPU known as Central Processing Unit. So in a way this is the brain of the PC, and here is a place where in my opinion you always buy this part. You buy the latest, and here are two companies that make CPUs. There are more, but there are just two that are more important to know. There is the Intel CPUs and there is the Ryzen CPUs. But in this case we will talk only about the Intel just so the video isn't really long, but whatever I say about Intel, in a way the same goes about Ryzen too. So when I say buy the latest CPU, I don't mean buy the latest and greatest. You only buy the latest, so that means that Intel makes new CPUs every year, and depending on what you need you buy the processor. For example, there are four main groups the Intel processor is divided into, and those are the i3, i5, i7, and i9. So what does that mean for you? Well, the higher the number the better, so the i9 is for hardcore gamers and it's for intense workloads. The i7 is worse than i9. But still the i7 is a really capable CPU. Then we have the i5, which is more efficient than the i7, but still it is worse than the i7 when it comes to performance. And then we have the i3, which is the weakest but the most efficient. It still can handle games. It is not a bottleneck for the GPU. About the GPU we will get into that later. But even the i3 is really capable, and believe me, there are a lot more things about the processor. But if you are not into technology and just what to know what those numbers mean, here is some info. And in my opinion you should get something with 6 cores. Even if you go with i3, you can manage with 4 cores, but I would recommend 6. And as always, the more the better, and don't forget you have performance cores and efficiency cores. And depending on how much you game you would need more performance cores. But if you are a casual gamer you can get away just with efficiency cores. And the most important thing, don't forget there are many i9 CPUs, so don't forget get the latest one. And as always, check the CPU before you buy the CPU. You can check it on YouTube or Google. There are a lot of info about every CPU, but just so you understand a little bit about CPU, you should know this. And don't forget, when it comes to price, the higher the number the more expensive the system will be. But be careful, because if you go for example with an i9 you will spend even more on other parts too, because you will need better cooling, better power supply and things like that. But let's not get into more detail about that, because this guide is just to let you know some of the more important things about parts. It's not about getting into a lot of details because this video would be too long. And now let's move on to GPU's graphics processing units. Now what does this part do and how important is this part? And it's interesting, because depending on what you want to do with your PC, this is worthless and you don't even need one, or you build your whole system around this one part. So ask yourself what you want out of this system. Because if you are someone who doesn't play games, and if you are someone who doesn't do any work that is rendering in it and stuff like it, then honestly, you don't even need a GPU. And if you are someone who plays some old games, if you are someone who spends most of his time replying to emails, watching YouTube or movies, then again you don't need to buy a separated GPU. You should know that a lot of CPUs have integrated GPUs. That means that they are capable of doing the things that the GPU can do. So if you decide not to buy a dedicated GPU, you should check and make sure the CPU you want to buy is integrated GPU. That is something you should keep in mind just in case. Now let's move on to people who play games casually and they like to play some of the most popular games. Then you will need to buy a GPU. But again, if you are just a casual gamer and don't need 100 plus frames per second, you don't need 4K images, then you can get away with some old GPUs like a GTX 1660 Super or some card relevant to it. You can check what you need it to do, then check if this card can run the games you need. And if you need something better, get something better like a 3050. You know, some cheap alternatives, but you should know this are not the latest, this are not the best. So check out what they can do and see if you can be happy with their performance. And of course, if you need the latest and greatest, go with a RTX 4090. This is the best of the best. If there is a game that can be run on a PC, then you don't need to even check. This card can run those games. So this GPU is mostly used for games and for rendering videos or rendering images and things like that. And don't forget there are two main companies that make GPUs. There's Nvidia and there's AMD. These are the two main companies, and now there's the Microsoft that is making GPUs. But if you are new to PC and you don't want any hassle, don't buy any GPU from Intel, at least not now. You will face a lot of problems. I am sorry, this is just a guide, and like I said, I will tell you how to find parts, not what to buy and what not to buy. But if you aren't educated in technology and don't want to be always in the settings of the GPU, just don't go with this. Just buy anything from AMD or Nvidia. Sorry to Microsoft, I really do hope they grow and start making better software and better hardware for their GPUs, but when it comes to GPUs, they are a big company, but they are new to the GPU market, and they are not the best at the moment, not spec-wise, and they are even harder to use, so let's not waste more time here. These two were the hard part and these were the hard choices. Now let's move on to RAM, and RAM is easy. There is DDR3, DDR4, and DDR5. You have others, but they are not selling anymore, and if you see other things, just don't get it. So let's get into RAM, and DDR3 isn't worth it. It's really slow, and RAM isn't that expensive. Depending on the speed of the RAM, you can spend a lot or be really cheap, but honestly DDR4 has gone down in price, and you don't need the best when it comes to RAM. If you buy something in the mid-range, and the speed of the RAM is measured with megahertz, and if the speed is over 3000 megahertz, then it is still good for gaming and for everyday work, and it isn't expensive. You can get that for probably less than $50 new, even without searching. If you find a good deal, then you can make it with $20. I have seen those deals go down, but it doesn't matter. You can go with DDR5, but in my opinion it's not worth it. I mean, if you go with the latest and greatest and want to spend thousands of dollars on your system, then by all means go ahead. But for most people it doesn't matter. Now let's see how much RAM you need, and go for at least 16 gigabytes. You can manage 8 now and maybe buy 8 later, but you will need 16 gigabytes for it to be a capable machine. Even if you don't do gaming, you will have at least a dozen of tabs open on Chrome, and that will help a lot on those situations. And just for a heads up, I recommend go with 2 sticks of 8 gigs. Don't go with a single stick of 16 gigs. The system will just run smoother and faster. There's no downside to using 2 sticks, just trust me. Put the sticks in dual channel, that's all. And that was RAM, easy and simple. Make sure the RAM is made from a reputable brand that is known for quality. Now let's move to storage, and there are 2 main groups of storage on PC. There are the HDD hard disk drive, and then we have SSD solid state drive. And the choice on what to buy is clear. You don't want the hard disk drive. It's slow, it's not safe, and it's actually not that much cheaper than the SSD. And when we look at the SSD, there are a lot of types of SSD, and I don't want to lecture you a lot, so I will just mention 2 types. And here we have SATA SSD and M.2 SSD. And here, if you want to go with a cheap storage, or if you want to buy a lot of storage, the SATA SSD is one of the cheapest SSD. But if you want to spend a little bit more and want your system to be a little bit faster, go with an M.2 SSD. And honestly, there are more expensive and better SSDs, but if you need that much performance, just check them. But the video would be too long if we mention them all and tell the differences. And they are not that important, at least they don't affect your everyday life. Not even when it comes to games, they just don't matter that much. But if you are transferring extremely large amount of data on an everyday basis, then check them out. But for most people that's not the case. And when it comes to how much memory you need, well, it depends. If you want it for a few games and want to store some files, then you would get away with half a terabyte. I mean, let's be honest, 512 gigabytes of memory is good enough for most people, but depending on how much games you want to have installed and how much files you want to download, that might change, so look it up for yourself. Just don't forget, never go with a hard disk drive. Make sure the SSD is made from a reputable brand that is known for quality. You can easily check that. Just so you are safe when buying parts, keep that in mind. And after storage we go with power supply, and here I cannot say anything, actually you will have to make your own math, sorry about that, but it is simple, I promise. So when buying a power supply, don't go with the most expensive, don't go with the cheapest, but just see how much power does your CPU need, then look it up, how much power does your GPU need, and when you add those up, get the power supply a couple hundred watts higher, and you get that so your power supply runs smoother and it's good. When you make upgrades, so you don't have to upgrade the power supply later on, it is simple, just make sure the power supply is made from a reputable brand that is known for quality. You can easily check that on YouTube or Google, but I just wanted to give you a heads up. And now let's see what we are going to buy for a motherboard, and here we have the easiest decision and the hardest at the same time. So here we have to check something else too. What do we need to check? Well, stay tuned so you don't miss that. So the motherboard doesn't actually affect performance, it just connects the parts of your system together, so you don't actually need to choose the motherboard on what you want to do with your PC. But what you have to look when buying a motherboard is looking if it is compatible with the parts that you have already chosen. So you need to find a motherboard that has the space for all the parts you want, and make sure the parts are compatible with the motherboard. And that leads us to our other problem. Before you purchase the parts, make sure you have found all the parts you need. It doesn't matter if you found them on deals or anything. Just before you press purchase, make sure that all the parts are compatible with each other. I cannot stress this enough. This is really important, and this isn't hard. You can check it on Google. You can check what are the best programs to check compatibility. You can look it up on PC Parts Picker, just to check if they are somewhat compatible. It is not perfect, but it will tell you at least a couple of problems if there are any, and it might give you something else to replace that. But check other programs you feel more comfortable with, or maybe you just ask someone you know to give the parts a quick look and tell you if they work together. Let's be honest, we all know someone who is into tech and likes this kind of stuff. Let him deal and help you with this, but just make sure everything runs perfectly before you buy anything. And now we are moving on to the last part, and that is the case and cooling system. That's right, this is the last part because we are not going to talk about monitors, keyboards, headsets and things like that on this video because they are mostly a preference thing, and I don't think it is important, at least not for this video. So let's move on to the case and cooling system. And there's a reason I left this for last, and that is because you choose the case and the cooling system after you have chosen the parts, and the reason is simple, because the case and the cooling system are there just to protect and cool the system, nothing else. And you cannot decide the size of the case if you don't know how big the PC parts are, and you cannot decide what case you want because depending on the system you might want more or less airflow. And what do I mean by that? If you have just an i3 on your system with integrated GPU, you don't need a big case and you don't need a good cooling system. But when we take a look, for example, an i5 or i7 with a capable GPU, then you might benefit from a somewhat good cooling system with a lot of airflow. I will not tell you in this video how to position the fans and things like that because it doesn't matter for this video. Check that thing on other people's videos. I will just tell you what you should look for if you have a certain setup. And if you have a high-end PC, then you are out of luck. Believe me, you can do it yourself, but in my opinion, just give it to a professional, because you might want water cooling, which is hard to do for beginners and it is dangerous for you and your system. And if you use fans, if you have like an high-end i9 and an RTX 4090, then if you mess up the airflow and have like negative air pressure, then the system will heat up regularly. That's something to keep in mind. Sorry, I couldn't help you more, but this was supposed to just educate you on a couple of important things. It's not like a full in-depth guide. It is something simple that everyone can get, and you know enough so you know where to look at and what to look for. So if you liked this video, like, if you didn't subscribe, if you want to watch more content like this, subscribe so you don't miss other new videos, and make sure to watch my old videos. You never know, you might learn a thing or two. Tell me down in the comments if you think I missed something important, even though I know I did, because this is not supposed to be an in-depth guide, but you can tell me what you want the next video to be and I might just cover it. This was Ray, and I hope I catch you in the next one.